Hello, welcome to Transform Your Workplace, the show that equips you to build teams that perform, grow, and love where they work. I'm Brandon Laws. Every week, we unpack frameworks and stories that turn today's challenges into tomorrow's competitive edge. Today's episode is brought to you by my team at Xenium HR. Let's face it, employees want learning that's easy to access and actually useful. But most companies either overspend on random workshops or underserve their people entirely. Xenium's Learning and Development Program fixes that with one flat monthly fee that unlocks unlimited live virtual workshops for every employee, a rich library of on-demand and micro-learning courses, and 6 to 8 week leadership cohorts led by seasoned coaches. Packages start at around $199 per month for an employer, so you can train your whole organization for less than the cost of one offsite lunch. Check it out at xeniumhr.com and give your people the best growth plan they deserve. In just a minute, you'll hear my conversation with John Rossman, former Amazon executive and author of The Amazon Way and Big Bet Leadership. In about a 30-minute discussion, you'll discover two flavors of customer obsession and the strategic vision most leaders overlook, a zero-based redesign trick that slashes red tape and speeds up decision-making, how frugality, when used wisely, fuels rather than starves innovation, and a step-by-step playbook for placing big bets that transform your organization without dropping the ball on today's results. Grab that cup of coffee, open your notes app, and let's get into it. Here's my conversation with John Rossman. John, it is such a pleasure to have you on Transform Your Workplace. Thanks for coming on the show.
Brandon, great to connect. Great to talk. We talked a little Oregon history beforehand. Yeah. So yeah, great to be here.
I love that your old roots are in my area. So it's always fun to connect with people from the Portland area.
I am a fifth generation Oregonian. I don't live in Oregon anymore, but my mom used to always remind me that I'm a fifth generation Oregonian. So yes.
I love it. Well, we're going to talk about several of your books. You've got a bunch of them. I'm going to hone mostly in on the Amazon Way, Amazon's 14 leadership principles. We'll also talk about big bet leadership, and you can weave in some of that here. But I wanted to just kind of get your sense of the early days of Amazon. You said you had a front row seat to Amazon's early playbook. And I mean, as we know today, Amazon is a behemoth of an organization. Clearly they did some things right. And these 14 principles are fascinating. Looking back, what was that moment for you inside Amazon where you're like, this company's doing things very differently, and you wrote about it and you want to have the world understand why?
So I was an early leader at Amazon. I was there for 4 years, and it was really the period. So it was 2002 through 2005. It was when Amazon was starting to realize a few things. And among those things was like, oh, we're not just a first party e-commerce retailer, and we're not even just a marketplace retailer. We're a platform company, right? And so we're a platform company that builds things for other people to use. Sometimes our internal teams, sometimes we externalize things. And when I was there, these leadership principles, they weren't codified at that point, but we were hammering them out every single day. It was like, God, how do we think about this? How do we experiment? How do we hold each other accountable? What are our expectations? How do we, we saw Bezos in action so much. It's like, how do we put, kind of a framework around, the type of deliberate principle-based thinking that he and others did at Amazon. It wasn't solely him and stuff. And so it was actually after I left Amazon that the leadership principles were codified. And it was honestly after I left Amazon. So when I left Amazon in 2006, I became a partner at a firm called Alvarez & Marsal, really good kind of turnaround, restructuring, corporate performance improvement firm. Ironically, my biggest client was the Gates Foundation. And I wrote this one white paper 6 years after I'd left Amazon about some concepts from Amazon. It was called Future Ready Self-Service. And one of my clients from the Gates Foundation pulled me in and he goes, John, this is really good. And then he told me like the 10 things I should have done better on it. Because he's a journalist and an editor by background. And he goes, but I've noticed that you do a really interesting job of delicately taking the principles, the tactics, the mechanisms from Amazon and inserting them into our work. I think you ought to write a book about this. So I took that signal, and that was the perfect timing. So the first edition of the Amazon Way released in 2014, and I just caught the zeitgeist of like Amazon, the rest of the country starting to see Amazon for what they've become today, which is like, oh, they aren't this wacky left coast e-commerce bookstore, and everything, right? Like they're a platform company. They're more than the everything store. And I just happened to kind of catch that story, and so glad I listened to the market telling me like, oh, you do an interesting job. But that was the practice that I just had, was like, how would Bezos respond to this situation was basically the scenario I would always run by myself and everything. And that's always a good way to think through things.
So while you were there, the principles weren't necessarily stated. They were just sort of maybe embedded into the culture, but not documented in a way that...
Not codified. Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
One of the things that I've always felt, as an Amazon consumer, I mean, I'm one click buying every day, it seems like, is the obsession they have around customers and the customer experience. And I'm wondering where this came from. Was it just Amazon needs to be different? We need to put the customer at the center. What was that whole thing?
That one started early and started with Jeff's insight. A lot of these came from other people and Jeff's willingness to learn and be curious and learn from others, and everything. But that one really came from Jeff, from day one. Amazon talked about being the world's most customer-centric company ever. But the thing that I've taken away from that is that there's really two types of customer obsession. One is kind of the everyday, get this transaction, make this particular situation, experience, customer, delighted, and everything, right? I call that tactical customer obsession. The other is the willingness to deploy resources and spend time in kind of looking upstream and downstream in a customer experience and being curious about more than just your product, your service, your experience, and how the customer experiences you. And I call that strategic customer obsession. And Amazon, it does both really, really well. And they spend time and resources on exploring and thinking about things way outside the current scope of what a customer does today. And that's really been, I think, the curiosity, which is a named leadership principle. That's the curiosity that builds off of customer obsession, is like, your customers are the best signal in the market. Like, figure out their job and how you might help them in a bigger, broader way than you do today.
You wrote that the best customer service is no customer service. And I want to know what you mean by that. But at the same time, what I'm fascinated by Amazon is because they're putting the customers at the center, they're reducing friction. And I think that's what you're probably meaning by this.
Yeah.
That because most of us, like me, are consuming Amazon and they're forcing other businesses to level up their game, it's also making its way into company culture as well. Reducing friction, making a better experience. And it's because of companies like Amazon that I think is just changing society in general. I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Well, so yes. So the third leadership principle is called invent and simplify. And I've always found it interesting. I think the more interesting and valuable part of that leadership principle isn't the invention, it's the and simplify part of that leadership principle. And obviously from a customer experience standpoint, the simplification, not to skip over that, because there's a tremendous opportunity still most companies have and in improving the customer experience. And that statement of the best service is no service, that was not my line. Bill Price, who was the first VP of customer service at Amazon, kind of coined that frame, wrote a really good book called The Best Service is No Service and everything. But that mindset of like, your customer typically doesn't really want what you're offering. They want the outcome of what they're offering, especially in a business services environment, right? And they don't really want to talk to you and ask you questions. They'd rather it just works and that the outcome happens. And that mindset of using customer signals to tell you not just how do you improve customer interactions and customer experience, and things like hold time and whatnot, but like actually go upstream of that and rethink your product, your service, your value proposition, like super powerful, lots of opportunity. But the and simplify piece internally, everybody's, thinking through how do I apply AI, in my work and everything. Important, but that's not where you should start. Where you should start is how do you actually go about a zero-based redesign of radically simplifying the work definition, data definition, job definition, metrics, inputs and outputs, policies, procedures, all of those things. Radically simplify, because we've all built these things up. They're all calcified. They're just slowly layers upon layers. Especially, I've worked with a lot of companies that have grown through acquisition, and it's just a mess. The most interesting work I get to do with enterprises today is simplifying their internal, I'll call it work, all of the things that go around. If you think about what work is, right? It's a transformation activity. Something comes in, something comes out. The work is what does that. And rethinking that is a highly, highly valuable exercise for any company of scale.
Yeah, I wonder what are some ways that organizations or leaders could add that to their just regular day of inventing and simplifying? Because it seems to me like when you add those layers on top, it's really hard to unwind. I think about what's happening with the federal government right now too, where they're like unwinding things that have been in place forever. And it seems painful for sure.
So first is having 35-year career, 20 of it now post Amazon and everything, is that it is really difficult to ask an operational leader to do both the job of running today's business and to actually transform it. You can do incremental improvements and everything, but that will just lead to incremental changes. An actual transformation like doing a zero-based re-engineering, redesigning of the organization, you can't just put that into place in like, oh, I've got a half-hour meeting on this, or I've got a committee relative to this, or like any other excuse to think about something, but to actually not do something about it, and everything, right? And really, that is the inspiration of what led my co-author of Big Bet Leadership and I to write Big Bet Leadership, your transformation playbook for winning in the hyper-digital era. Is like, you actually need a different playbook in order to do that transformation style work, whether it's a redesign, whether it's a new market entry, whether it's a digital strategy, like whatever it is, if it has significant upside and risks, dependencies, unknown unknowns, that's what a big bet is. And we needed a different playbook for that. We built that playbook at T-Mobile. We kind of genericized it back out. It builds off of so many of the principles from Amazon. And so all of these dots kind of connect across my career and everything. But that's why we wrote Big Bet Leadership, because you can't incrementalize your way to a transformation. That's my belief, point one out of this conversation.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. It's a different playbook, because I think a lot of leaders fall in the trap of like, we want to make this transformation, but like the urgency of the fires in front of you are going to get your attention every time.
I've got a business I'm working with, really dynamic business, great team, but it's so dynamic that they are just putting out fires all the time. And they're like, okay, John, we need to transform this core process and everything. It's like, great, you guys can't do it because
with what time?
You're not only fractionalized into this process, but everything about your orientation, your bias, the way you think about something is captured and framed by the current state. We need to create a separate team, a fresh perspective to design this transformation. We're going to keep it highly connected to the current state. We're not going to wait until we get to a perfect future state before we start implementing something, but we do need a period of time to actually have some unconstrained thinking and do an actual redesign, re-envisioning of the current state. I call that thinking and outcomes, right? Like, what's the current requirements and problem? what would be the ideal state, define that, actually like codify it in a way that is discernible, and then work backwards. And when you go about a transformation in that manner, you completely rethink what the requirements are, what's needed, how to go about doing it. And that's how you unleash material improvements, not just incremental improvements.
One of the other principles I love and I wanted to touch on was ownership. I think every business can benefit from instilling ownership in their leadership. And you tell a funny story in the early days of Amazon about this Christmas party where somebody's planning the party and they have a tree, but they don't have a base to it. And they nail the trunk to the floor. The floor was a rented space, I think, for the party. So didn't own it. It was somebody else's rental space. And you're kind of making the point of like, that's a short-sighted decision.
Bezos has used that story to demonstrate like how a renter versus an owner thinks about something, and everything, right?
Yeah.
One of the keys of these principles, well, it's kind of two keys, but one point is it's not just the title of the principle. There's a paragraph where you really kind of like understand it better. And then there's a set of mechanisms, like things you do to put it into place. And so on ownership, let me just read the paragraph behind that. It says, leaders are owners. They think long-term and don't sacrifice long-term value for short-term results. They act on behalf of the entire company beyond just their own team. They never say, that's not my job. Oh man, there's a lot of concepts packed into that. And what you see in every company out there is local optimization and the sub-optimizations get pushed to the enterprise level. And so having this mindset of when is it the time to be thinking about like your specific job and doing that versus when are we talking about the enterprise? And we put aside our specific job title and kind of the blinders relative to that. And we think about what's best for the enterprise. That's what that leadership principle urges good leaders to do. And it also like this notion of you never sacrifice long-term value for short-term results. There was a survey of over 800 CFOs, and they were asked the question, if you needed to reduce long-term enterprise value in order to make this quarter's revenue results, would you do it? And over 75% said yes. And everything, right? That shows you it's not that they're bad people. They're not. They're great people. But the pressure we're all under to deliver for today, this type of leadership principle is the counterbalance to all those pressures and biases that we normally put on ourselves. And so if the leadership team can actually have some wisdom like this, like, hey, here's how we think about things. Here's how we prioritize and everything, like that just brings counterbalance to the pressures and the biases that we all suffer as people and as leaders in a business.
So well said, because I think in many organizations, there is pressure to have those short-term results.
Oh,
and
you think so?
We're missing the compound interest that we put in on the daily basis, though, if we think where we want to be in the future. So we don't sacrifice the future for short-term.
Right. And it's the type of constraint. It doesn't say that you don't deliver short-term results. What it says is that you don't sacrifice long-term results in order to get to short-term results. You actually have to have both. And the 14th leadership principle is called deliver results, right? And so now I have to do something in a way that doesn't sacrifice long-term results, but actually delivers short-term benefits too. That forces you to rethink the situation differently, right? And so it's going to put you in a different problem-solving motion because you have different constraints, different levers that you can pull and everything. Like, okay, so now we're really going to invent and simplify because I have to deliver both. I can't sacrifice long-term value. I still have to deliver short-term results. And people oftentimes, people try to trap me in these principles all the time, and everything, right? And, the first is now there's 16. It's a lot. You have to know which principle to use in the right circumstance. You don't use all 16 at once but you typically use more than one in a specific point. That's where real wisdom is needed in leveraging these. But people try to trap me in these, customer obsession, or so you don't have to deliver short-term results. Like, no, that's not what the leadership principle says. That's why the paragraph is so important. You just don't get to sacrifice long-term benefits to deliver short-term results. So those are the types of closely nuanced wordings that are really important here.
You wrote in the book about how hiring and developing people and talent is one of the most important decisions as a leader. I'm curious, like inside Amazon and other high-performing companies that you've worked closely with, what is it about their hiring strategies and even development strategies that make them great?
I'd say first is that Amazon is in no way perfect, but at their scale, if you're just better than the average big company, like you've got an incredible lever and leverage in your business. But I would say in general, at times, Amazon hasn't always shown the commitment to development that it needs to show. And so, that's having empathy and really being committed to like, how do you give somebody every opportunity to be successful is key. But, that starts at the moment of hiring. And it is partially both qualifying the individual, but it's also about setting expectations with that individual, and everything, right? And so, there's a few techniques relative to this, but, one that Amazon has talked a lot about is their bar raiser interview. And the biggest mistakes people make relative to hiring is rushing, right? Like, I got a job, it needs to be done. I rush to hire somebody. Some jobs, that's fine, and everything, right? But most, white collar productivity or kind of, thinking jobs, like you need to be careful about that. And so Amazon has this concept, bar raiser interview. And what the bar raiser is that somebody that's trained to interview kind of based off these leadership principles for a specific job category. And the essential question they're asking is like, does this person raise the bar relative to that general capability for the enterprise? And the interesting thing about the way that the decision goes is it's a veto-based system. It's not a voting system, right? So the bar raiser, no matter, even if the hiring manager says, no, we're hiring this person, the bar raiser can veto the hire. So it's a degree of independence from the pressure of hiring for today with a longer term perspective. So good job. That's why this kind of ties into short-term versus long-term perspectives, because jobs are going to change. If you hire both great talent and talent that's aligned to kind of your culture and your principles, then you're going to create a more fungible team that can evolve appropriately as the work evolves.
What about on the development side? Like, how are we nurturing the talent in our organizations? And if you think about where we're at as a society or as businesses are evolving, where are you investing in? What skills?
I'll answer a slightly different question. I think the main mistake that people make relative to talent, and we'll call it culture, is they think that a culture has to be like the environment that helps anybody be successful. And I think it's slightly different than that. I think culture is the environment that helps the right people be successful. And that's why I think doing something like writing out your leadership principle, paragraph mechanisms, and really making those real helps define what our culture is, right? What's culture? Well, culture is what happens when the parents aren't in the room, right? Like if nobody's looking, this is what happens. That's what culture is, right? And it's not a poster on the wall. It's like what happens in everyday meetings and everyday decisions at both the executive level, mid-level, and low level in an organization. And that's why I think these leadership principles from Amazon are so foundational for their success, is because while not perfect in any way, it does help create a standard for how anybody can understand this is what our culture is. And so that they can attract, retain, and develop the right culture for Amazon. So in this third edition of the Amazon Way, the new appendix I put in it was about building your own leadership principles. And what this is a framework for how you can go about building your own leadership principles. I actually just developed a custom GPT to help you develop your leadership principles. I'm happy to share it with anybody for free. Just get a hold of me on LinkedIn and I'll share the GPT with you. But it does a really nice job of kind of facilitating with you to think through, what are you trying to get done, and what are some real principles and mechanisms, and then how do you roll this out to an organization? And I think that is I've done that a number of times with clients, and it really is about the intensity of the leadership team and their willingness to evolve their own personal behavior and how they work as an executive team. If you can get that team to make just a little difference and kind of codify their perspectives, try this out a little bit. I call it being etched in jello, right? Like, let's try these on, let's work them in a little bit. Don't say these are it forever and everything. Just like, yeah, here's what we're trying out, and everything. But if that team can actually put these into play, then that will be the real change driver over time. This isn't a fast move. This isn't a fast fix. This is a slow fix, but powerful fix that helps build the right culture.
You quoted Jeff Bezos in the book. He says, if you double the number of experiments you do, you double your inventiveness, end quote. I think in cultures who might be a little bit more risk averse, how do we create this psychologically safe workplace where we can make mistakes, maybe take a little bit more risk and double those experiments?
That's a big question, and some of which I'll align on, and some of the premise of it I'll reject and everything. So first is that word failure, right? And so fail fast, fail forward, and all that. Like, that term is overloaded, right? It means two things. It means at least two things, right? It means both experimentation. We learn from the experiment, we move forward. That's what we want. But failure also means we're sloppy. We don't have the right professionalism. We don't go about it the right way. Well, that's not acceptable in any scenario. So clients I work with, like, we don't embrace those terms around failure. We embrace experimentation and having high standards. Okay, now I experiment, but I have high standards. Now I've taken this concept, I've unpacked it into two discernible terms. Now we can actually start talking about what and when and how and where are we experimenting, and what are the right standards to have on any kind of work, job, task, or things like that. And so that's where I always start, is like, that term, it gets used and abused both deliberately and not deliberately all the time. And so that's where I start with a big question like that, is like, that's too hard of a concept to contemplate. And I think the other thing that goes along with this is actually being more deliberate about, well, when are we experimenting? Like, what is the experiment versus just kind of this, I call it all hats, no cattle approach to innovation, which is just like, hey, we just want to be saying we're innovating, but like, we don't really mean it. We're not really in it to win it, and things like that, right? I've been involved in a lot of situations that, kind of innovation lab situations like that and everything. And it's like, oh, I know this pattern. We write about this a lot in Big Bet Leadership, of like how to manage the organization, right? The team that's going to be doing this, and how to avoid these scenarios, these aspects of failure mode that all come around. You have to have a high standard for work, regardless of what the job is. And you have to put that work in an environment where they can be successful. So we kind of outline the constraints that you want to put this innovation team under, so that they can do their job, both experiment correctly, but we have high expectations for how they go about doing it. And I think that's typically it tends to be the right time. But the other thing that has to be addressed is kind of like, is the leadership team, is the board truly intent on what this path means, and everything? Because what this path means is, we are going to forego some short-term profitability, and we are going to invest it now in our future with unknown outcomes and everything, right? Like that's what a big bet is, right? A big bet is an idea or concept that has high potential, but it has risks, dependencies, unknowns to it that make it less predictable, and it's certainly not short-term than a little incremental move. You got to get the board and the executive team aligned, set up, incentivized to create a long-term systematic growth machine. And I think that's ultimately one of the things that makes Amazon not the only firm like this, but maybe the easiest to recognize, is that they are both a world-class operator and they are a systematic big bet machine. That is what makes Amazon so unique. And they do it across so many different categories of businesses, right? Like they're not a one horse type of business. Like they've got real businesses in 15 or 20 different categories, and everything, right? And I think that's why Amazon is such a powerful company. You never want to mimic somebody, but you can learn from them, right? And that's what I've tried to do with these books, The Amazon Way, Think Like Amazon, Big Bet Leadership, is what can you learn from a company like Amazon who've created their own playbook for how they do this, and then how do you apply it to yourself?
One of the things I found surprising, because I didn't know this about Amazon, is you said they emphasize and they're very deliberate about keeping costs down, or they're cost conscious, they're frugal is what you said. Why does Jeff Bezos and the leaders at Amazon believe that frugality actually drives innovation? I think it ties in kind of close to what you're talking about with the experimentation, but I'm just curious. I had no idea.
So frugality is one of the leadership principles. A couple of years ago, kind of at the peak of the pandemic madness and everything, I write a Substack newsletter called the Digital Leader Newsletter, and I wrote about frugality, the forgotten leadership principle. But that's where wisdom takes, like, hey, we pull this lever at the right time. Well, if you think about really what Andy Jassy has been doing the past couple of years, it's kind of like putting frugality back in play and rethinking some of the spend. But today, frugality is critical because it forces you to rethink things, right? It's just another one of the constraints or levers as we invent and simplify how work gets done, treasuring our resources, not being wasteful in our resources. How can we argue with that as being a good part of a business and of a culture? Having respect for the table that's been given to us, the opportunity, the existing business has been given to us, and that we have to be good stewards and create a better business for tomorrow for the next generation. I think that's an essential leadership mindset. And so frugality really comes to kind of like staying humble, respecting, we've been given a ton. Our job as stewards here is to create a better business. And we do that by respecting resources and driving to make ourselves more efficient as we scale.
Yeah, there's something to be said about being frugal or being resource constrained, instilling the creativity to figure out better ways of doing things. I mean, I see it in my own work all the time. It's like, okay, I'm not getting any more people, or I'm not getting any more money. Now I've got to figure out, is there a technology I can throw at a process, or is there something I can do to do things better than I did before?
I've said a couple times, leadership principles have to be used with wisdom and everything, right? There's a big difference between being frugal and being cheap. And that's a fine line, takes wisdom, takes good judgment, and everything, right? But there is a time for celebration. There is a time for, especially when your brand is on display, having a really nice event. I get invited all the time. I get to do a lot of keynote speaking. I get invited to these great galas, and customer experience. That's a good time not to be cheap, not to be frugal, because you're saying thank you to your customers and it's your brand moment. So there's a big difference between being frugal and being cheap. You have to use these principles with wisdom, apply the right ones at the right time.
Since the release of the Amazon Way in 2014, I think you're in your third edition now, and you offered a 15th principle, the golden rule, that you would suggest to Amazon. Why did you feel like this was the missing principle?
So I was writing this book in 2021, kind of peak pandemic period, and everything. Amazon was under attack, some fair, some not fair, relative to worker safety, their impact on the environment, all of that. And the key is listening to outside critics, but then thinking it through for yourself and everything. And so what I saw was like, there's some wisdom in that. Like there's some feedback in that. And so I framed a leadership principle called the golden rule, as you said. And it basically, like, at times, Amazon still acts like the startup that we were back in the early 2000s, and that we were almost out of business, and we were being referred to as Amazon.bomb and Amazon.org and Amazon.toast. That's not Amazon anymore, right? And at times, they need to kind of act as a steward for bigger than just their own shareholders. And that's what I encourage them to do in this leadership principle. Ironically, 2 months after I released this book, and I'm not saying I influenced this, but I'm also saying you can't prove that I didn't, Amazon released a 15th and 16th principle. I personally think that mine is framed in a more durable and useful manner than the two they added were be the world's best employer, and with success and scale brings broad responsibility and strive to be the world's best employer. So I think even Amazon recognized that there was feedback coming that they needed to appreciate. And that's what they're trying to address in that 15th and 16th leadership principle. So maybe they saw my book, maybe they didn't, I don't know. But I think it was to some degree an obvious need that they need to start acting their size at times. Now, counterbalance that, like you want to stay this entrepreneurial, accountable, urgent driven, entrepreneurial. Andy Jassy talks about wanting to be the world's largest startup. That's what you want, but you got to counterbalance it with act your age, not your shoe size mentality and everything here too. So that's where I would kind of say, again, all these leadership principles need to be applied at the right time for the right effect.
John, we talked mostly about the Amazon way. Big Bet Leadership is your newer book, and I'm curious, we didn't really touch on that book a whole lot, but if there's any like big idea from that book, a big bet that leaders need to make.
So a couple. I got to be the senior innovation advisor at T-Mobile for 3 years. My client was Kevin McCaffrey. Kevin McCaffrey is the co-author of Big Bet Leadership. This was in part the playbook that we put in at T-Mobile. Kevin's job was new business incubation. So if you think about T-Mobile, the big business is their core wireless, both B2B and B2C businesses. They needed to figure out a way to identify and experiment and then figure out how to scale small experiments in a culture and a company that didn't know how to do it. So we took a lot of the stuff from Amazon and a few other places and designed a system specifically for T-Mobile. We then genericized it and repackaged it for Big Bet Leadership. So Big Bet Leadership is a playbook specifically for senior leaders and the teams that serve senior leaders. Remember, I mentioned kind of operating playbook, big bet playbook. This is the playbook to do that experimentation, transformation play. A big bet is a big ambition that comes packed, whether you recognize it or not, with a ton of risks. And those things have a horrible failure rate. Like any transformation, major initiative, big idea, incredible failure rates. And we wrote this book because we think that there's a better way, and we pack it with principles and specific things to do. So it's a very actionable playbook. And it comes with an online free resources that help take the book. It's a very short, readable book into action in your teams. So super proud of that book, and it specifically designed for that kind of need, which I think is a need in most every organization. And if you think about the future and the impact, like, do we think change is going to increase or decrease in the future?
Increase.
I think it's going to increase, right? Are we good at making that change today? Yes or no? No, we're not very good at this, right? And so that's where we saw a huge market need, which was senior leadership. Here's tactical and principled ways to think about this job that you need to do better, which is to actually transform your current business and your current organization.
That's so well said. I think the change is going to get more intense from here on out. I believe that many organizations are scrambling to figure out how to automate their businesses, get AI into their businesses, and nobody's really quite figured it out. I think the next several years are going to be pretty transformational if companies adopt and adapt.
So the subtitle of Big Bet Leadership is Your Transformation Playbook for Winning in the Hyper-Digital Era.
We're right here.
Oh, what's the hyper-digital era? You're probably asking, right? So that's the preface of the book, is essentially this forecast of what's coming. If you think about the past, 25 years of digital transformation, the hyper digital era is our forecast for what the next 25 years is. And the forecast summarizes with the fact we're going to see organizational productivity operating models that are 10 to 100x more productive than the current status quo organization is, right? That's what's going to be different about this next 25 years versus the past 25 years. The past 25 years, we've been on this slow general incline of productivity. That's changing, radically changing. You better have a different playbook for how you address that. And that's why we wrote this book, was to help you tackle that type of transformational need. And you can't wait until you need to do it. Like it's like an athlete. You need to build capacity. You need to build an organization that understands how to operate in today and invent for the future as an organization. Don't wait until it's too late. Be early in these conversations as early as possible.
Well said, John. I know you've got a lot of great material on your website. Is there a good place to look at your work, follow your work? I know you said you had a Substack as well. Point people to anything that you'd love to point to.
I've got the multi-channel problem here and everything. So yes, The Amazon Way, Think Like Amazon, Big Bet Leadership, all books and great audiobooks for sale at Amazon. You can find me at johnrossman.com or LinkedIn. Super simple. And I do all of this work not as praise for Amazon or anyone else, but to deliver leaders tactical ways to think differently and act differently to get a different set of results.
My guest today has been John Rossman. John, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Brandon, great to meet you.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent. So discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.